Welcome to the Golf and Fitness Show, brought to you by PGA Tour Active. I'm your host, Cory Gregory, and on today's show, we have a very special guest. It's the trainer responsible for the dramatic changes in the 2020 U.S. Open champion, Bryson DeChambeau. The hot topic at every course is Bryson's crazy power that he's currently displaying in his total transformation into a 240-pound beast. That's on everyone's mind. We welcome master trainer and founder of Muscle Activation Techniques, who's been in the strength and conditioning field for over 30 years. I want to welcome to the show, Greg Roskopf. Welcome to the show, Greg.
Thank you, Cory. Nice to be here.
Man, I got to tell you, reading up on you and doing some research, I mean, congrats on all the success. You've been in the game for a long time, and what a cool way to kind of enter into, obviously it sounds like you did a lot of football, a lot of pro athletes, but to be in the golf world, that's got to be pretty cool, huh?
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I've been in pro sports for 30 years and I never really looked down the golf path because that's not the most working out, focused sport, but it's been pretty neat to see what Bryson's been able to do.
Yeah. How did that relationship start? And just give us a little background on how Bryson ended up reaching out to you.
So Bryson is from Fresno, and actually before I started my career in 1985 as a strength and conditioning coach at Fresno State. So I was in Fresno for 13 years, and one of the women that I happened to work with during that period, she ended up coming out and working for me with muscle activation techniques. Well, her brother is Mike Shy, who's Bryson's coach. And so Mike Shy always knew about muscle activation techniques and the process that we were going through. And so when Bryson got to college, we set him up when he went to SMU. We set him up with one of our practitioners in Dallas. And so he got exposed to muscle activation techniques through his college career. I think for about 3 years, he worked with this guy down in Dallas. And then once he went pro, he reached out through Mike. They reached out to me and said, we want to start working with you and we want to have him come out to Denver. And so he's been coming to Denver for the last 3 years, on the average about every 3 weeks.
Okay. Great. Go ahead and explain the MAT techniques real quick, just so people can have a concept of what you're referencing.
All right. So the foundational aspect of MAT is it basically looks at the muscle system's role in chronic pain and injury. And so whenever you have stress, trauma, or overuse, the resultant inflammation alters the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. And so the muscles just don't fire the way they're designed to fire. And the analogy I use, it's like having loose battery cables. It's like the inputs go into the muscles, but it's just, there's a dimmer switch on it. And it just, it's like you're trying to start your car, it won't start. And so the muscles are the same way. And that's what we call that muscle inhibition and correlating with muscle weakness. And so through muscle activation techniques, I look at every muscle in the body has its own communication pathways with the central nervous system, i.e. every muscle has its own set of battery cables. So through our assessment process, we're able to go in and identify where these altered communication pathways are. And through his hands-on therapy technique or a form of isometric, we can actually activate those muscles, which in simplistic terms is like tightening battery cables. Mm-hmm. And so literally we've identified where these altered communication pathways are, get those muscles activated, and immediately those muscles can fire and start to fire on demand. And so one of the interesting things about it is I had a fractured vertebrae when I was young, when I was 19, and I was working as a strength coach. And the ironic part was I was strong. I was bench pressing 400 pounds, squatting 500 pounds. But I had patellofemoral syndrome, plantar fasciitis, SI joint dysfunction, like one injury after another. And by the time I was 25, I'm like, if I'm this bad at 25, what am I going to be like when I'm 50? Well, the correlating factor is when you have these instability issues, the body tightens up as a protective mechanism. And so the focus is we need to stretch. We need to loosen up these tissues through deep tissue massage or stretching or foam rolling. And what the problem was every time I would stretch or get deep tissue massage, I couldn't get out of bed the next day because I'd have numbness and sciatica down in the big toe. And so I realized that, like when you walk on ice, the natural neurological response is the body tightens up as a protective mechanism when it senses instability. And so took me in a completely different focus, and I started realizing that the tightness that everyone's focusing on is because of this underlying weakness, or i.e. these loose battery cables. We can tighten battery cables, immediately the tightness goes away, and the protective mechanisms go away, and then you have mobility and stability. And so it's a completely different look at how the body functions and how to improve human body function.
Well, and coming from the powerlifting world, there's a lot of SI dysfunction, especially with the sumo squat or sumo deadlift, wide stance squats, more Westside type stuff, which is what I learned. I'm from Columbus, Ohio. And so I've been down this path. And then I had also jumper's knee for years and then healed that through isometrics. So I understand all that stuff. So I went back through those old 80s things and went through and realized those 5-minute isometric holds and all these things that really healed the tendon through time. So I can't wait to really check in deeper to this stuff. And what's wild to think about is that not only is Bryson more powerful, bigger, stronger, that you're telling me he's on all cylinders because of the techniques that you're speaking about.
Yes. Yeah. So the first thing when he came to me 3 years ago was he had some hip issues and some lower back pain, and all correlating with limitations in range of motion. And that's the nice thing is I can always tell where there's neuromuscular dysfunction because I just do range of motion assessment, and wherever the body can't move, it's saying that the muscles that move you there aren't contracting efficiently. And so we started seeing these limitations in range of motion. So the original goal was just developing a foundation, reestablish the communication pathways between the nervous system and the muscle system so that his body could function optimally through full ranges of motion at every joint. Once we got through that process and had a solid foundation, then basically we said, let's take it up a notch. And let's see how we can take this to a point to maximize your force output. So the greatest key about it is as we've challenged his body and increased the load that he's been working with, most people tighten up because their body ends up overloading the system and they end up tightening up with weight training. He's more flexible now than he's ever been, and he's stronger than he's ever been. And that's contradictory to what most weight training programs do, because most weight training programs actually are part of what causes that problem of the body tightening up.
Which is what we both have experienced personally.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What's so crazy is I used to think about this all the time, Greg, is that because I've ranged in body weights to 165 for powerlifting meets or bodybuilding shows all the way to 240 of not as quality of mass as Bryson. But I used to think, because I've played golf my whole life, and I'm like, what happens if a guy does essentially almost, and this is my perception, right? It's coming from the fitness world. Like, did Bryson go on some type of dirty bulk, but all of a sudden his strength is this high? And I know that's not what it is, but that was my initial perception. And I'm like, and what happens when you have that level of strength, but that type of swing ratio at the same time? And then you get, because I'm a hack golfer. And when I was 240, I was barely swinging, and my irons, my wedges were crazy. So I'm thinking, this dude's amazing at what he does. Now he combines, and on top of it is on all cylinders. Yeah. US Open, you see it. That's what
exactly.
Right? Is that I know that perception is not exact, but that was me as like a fan, like, wait a second here. Cause I'm about the same size guy. So I know what it feels like to weigh those body weights and squat 600 pounds and do all this kind of crazy stuff. So I was like, damn, he actually tapped into it.
Yeah. And the ironic part is that it's a whole different philosophy. Like you said, to squat 600 pounds. And that's where I came from, was this, compound lifting, deadlift, squatting, bench pressing. This process, we're only as strong as the weakest link. And where I said every muscle or group of muscles has its own set of, own connections with the central nervous system, or its own set of battery cables. We look at isolated movements. Like, what are all the movements that make up total body function? And like, he couldn't rotate. His rotation to the right side was limited when we first started. Well, rotation is a key component of golf. Yeah. With rotation comes side bend. And one of the things he was complaining about at the beginning, he goes, I just don't feel like I can maintain that side bent position as I'm trying to rotate through on the swing. And so we literally look at every isolated movement, and movement by movement, muscle by muscle, we maximize the force output. So his whole program is more about isolated movement. like exercises for trunk rotation, exercises for spinal side bend, exercises for spinal flexion, spinal extension, hip rotation, hip flexion, hip extension, hip adduction, hip abduction. Like we take every particular movement and we maximize the strength in every movement in his body so that the integrated system can function at a higher level. Because the integrated system is only as good as the function of its isolated parts. And so if there's a weak, and that other idea that we're only as strong as our weak link, if there's a weak link in the kinetic chain, like you said, when you were powerlifting, we end up with SI joint dysfunction. Pain is just an indicator that there's a problem. We got weak links here, and fix the problem is basically what it's saying. So anytime he has an issue where he starts to tighten up, let's go back. The first sign of neuromuscular dysfunction is correlating muscle tightness. The second sign is pain. You keep putting forces on the tissue that can't tolerate the forces because of the muscle inhibition. The body shouts out in pain saying, fix the problem. And so that's where we started by taking care of his pain. Then as we started loading his body, as long as he maintains his flexibility, he's not going to have pain because the flexibility is actually a sign of stability. And one of the greatest parts is he's never bench pressed, he's never squatted, he's never done any of the compound exercises. But out of curiosity, about 3 weeks ago, right before the Masters, he wanted to know, like, how strong am I from a compound standpoint? He went and threw on, in the NFL, they do 225 pounds on the bench press for repetition. And he went down and he lay down, did 10 reps with 225. And then he went up to 315, couldn't do 315 for one rep, dropped back down. The first time he ever benched, he benched 295 pounds because the isolated strength was there and it transferred over into his compound movements, which now then you see golf, it's showing up in his club head speed and ball speed.
That's amazing.
So, yeah.
But there's that. You guys deadlift and squat too?
What's that?
Did you guys deadlift and squat?
He hasn't tried that yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's coming.
He does have the fear of putting weight on his back, and he's never done it, so he has that fear. And I'm like, you know what? You have all your isolated parts strong; it's not a problem. But not going to push that. But I believe at some point, I'll just put it in perspective. I'm 57 years old. I had to stop deadlifting, squatting, and everything when I had my low back injury and all of the residual problems. Now I'm back. I do isolated exercises like Bryson's doing, and then I follow it up with compound day where I do squats, deadlifts, and power cleans. And so that would be the ideal situation, is transferring it into the compound motion and literally seeing the strength increases in the compound movements. But for him, his compound movement is golf. And as long as his ball speed and club head speed is increasing, he's happy.
That's a moneymaker.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you give me an idea when you refer to isolated exercises? If there's new people listening to this that don't understand the terminology, break down a very basic workout for Bryson and how do you split up? Is it traditional like a push-pull day, a back, or how many exercises traditionally do you do from an isolation standpoint? What's a rep ranges? What's kind of the setup to some of this stuff?
This is a real different process. When I'm working with him, I'm actually challenging his tolerance levels. And there's basically the way that I've put together, I call it muscle MATRX, which MSA muscle activation technique. RX is prescriptive rules. Like there's a neuromuscular hierarchy that the body goes through. That there's basically, when I talk about this movement by movement, muscle by muscle, there's 43 movement patterns in the body that account for all the muscles. And so basically, when I turn my head to the left and right, that's cervical rotation. Well, there's a group of muscles that have the primary function to rotate the cervical spine. When I side bend the head to the left and right, there's a different group of muscles that have the primary function to side bend the head to the left and right. Well, those principles follow through the body. There's muscles that rotate the spine. There's obviously muscles have multiple functions, but these muscles that have the primary function to rotate the spine, we're going to train those muscles through spinal rotation. The ones that have the primary function to side bend the spine, we're going to train those through spinal side bend. The ones that flex we're going to be specific to that motion. So it's all of these isolated movement that the body is able to perform in the body itself, besides the muscles of the fingers, toes, and I mean, say feet and wrist and hand. There's 21 main movements. And we can correlate some of those. We can say, well, I mean, hamstrings, that's knee flexion, quads is knee extension. But there's other movements like that. I mean, people train their core and they're holding their spine in neutral and saying, oh, now lift your legs and lift your arm. We don't function in neutral. We function through the extremes of range of motion. And injuries occur in the extremes of range of motion. Like the body doesn't say, I hurt myself doing this. They say, I hurt myself when I bent down to pick up my child, or I was swinging the club and I torqued my spine. And it happened. Pain shows up in the extremes of range of motion because that's where we're the most dysfunctional. When we are dysfunctional, that's where the dysfunction shows up. And that's why the body tightens up to protect you from moving into that position. And so literally, as people get more and more dysfunctional, they lose the ability to move through the extremes of range of motion. So the neutral position of the spine is the position we revert to when we're dysfunctional. We're training him to move in the positions under load into these extreme ranges that the body is usually trying to protect from. And so the workouts are based off of that. Like we're going to do exercises when you ask like the day-to-day process. He's going to do exercises first core, which can be spinal rotation, spinal flexions, hip flexion, hip extension, spinal side bend, spinal extension. I mean, all those movements that basically are where the muscles are responsible for moving basically the big muscles of the hip and the spine. Then we're going to have a leg day. A leg day is going to, I mean, we can tie in the glutes and the hip flexors with leg day, or we can tie them in with core because many of those muscles are affecting the core. And then we're going to have an upper body day. I mean, there's movements. I mean, you think of isolated movements. I mean, there's movements of internal and external rotation at the shoulder. There's movements of the simplistic movements of upward rotation, downward rotation, protraction, and retraction of the scapula. For every one of those movements, we have specific exercises that he's challenging the muscles that perform that function. So every isolated part gets stronger. Then we can go into the total body motions with chest press and shoulder press. But in order for you to properly press through shoulder press or chest press, you have to have a stable spine. You have to have the motion that moves the scapula on the thorax. You have to have the rotator cuff muscles able to hold the head of the humerus in the glenoid while the primary muscles perform the function. So the integrated system is only as good as the function of the isolated parts. So we make sure all the isolated parts are good before we move into those compound motions. And like in Bryson's case, he doesn't even do compound exercises for that reason. He doesn't need to.
Wow, Greg, this is so interesting, dude. Like, this is so cool. And so I recently ruptured my supraspinatus in my left shoulder, right? I was actually in a meet. I squatted 700, and at the end, I was doing the multiply division at 180 or 198. The weight actually slid down my back, and it just was like it was just very small, but because it was so quick, it partially tore it. 10 years goes by, and then finally completely ruptured it. And so I had to get really deep in the weeds because I chose not to get surgery and was able to rehab it myself. And I'm probably going to bench 300 over the next 2 weeks again, under 190, which is pretty good considering but to understand the serratus anterior and all the subscap work and that I have one less piece of tissue supporting the muscle now. So when you get that deep into it, but the way that you're explaining it is probably so far over people's heads, but to understand that you don't have to squat, bench, and deadlift to have this type of output. But if you have dysfunction along the way, you're never going to get there. And that right there, like going back to what you said earlier, was he having QL or like hip flexor problems when he first couldn't get the rotation? Because I think a lot of golfers have these similar issues that you probably see down the line. So it'd be interesting to see like, what's some of the common themes that you've seen since you've been working with Bryson?
Yeah. So when I'm thinking, like I said, there's muscles that have the primary function to rotate the spine. And so if somebody's limited in spinal rotation, I'm always thinking there's these group of muscles. It's the anterior fibers of the internal obliques, the anterior fibers of the external oblique. The transverse abdominis muscles are actually involved in that motion. And then upper rectus abdominis, those muscles are, basically far away from the axis for rotation. So those are the muscles that have the primary function to rotate the spine. So the QL, you think of its alignment, the QL is a side bender. Yep. So if I have a problem in side bend, I'm worried about the QL and some of the erector spinae muscle. So literally there's correlating factors. When I see a limitation in range of motion, say in spinal rotation, I can pretty much guarantee you that those muscles that I listed for spinal rotation have inhibitions. They're not functioning at a high level, so they have loose battery cable. So the first idea, and here's where the problem becomes, is the first thing is you have to jumpstart the muscles. Yeah. You have to tighten the battery cables. Then you can follow it up with exercise. If you have muscle inhibition, you think about it where I said you got loose battery cables, they're kind of sluggish, they don't contract on demand. Through functional movement, the muscles are going to fire on demand. So if I say rotate your spine, the central nervous system sends the information to get the muscles activated to create spinal rotation. Well, anything that will contract, can contract, will contract. So if the external obliques and internal obliques are inhibited, then you're going to have muscles like the multifidus and the iliocostalis and the QL that are trying to do a job that's not their primary function. Yeah. And so that's why the body's trying to, it's through compensation. Through compensatory mechanisms, my QL, my longissimus, my iliocostalis is trying to create spinal rotation, but that's not its function. So they're working at a mechanical disadvantage to perform the function that other muscles are supposed to. So through this process, we make sure that the muscles that rotate the spine can rotate the spine, the muscles that side bend the spine can side bend the spine. So we get the muscles activated relative to their particular function. Then we follow it up with strengthening. So you have to jumpstart the battery so that then you can drive your car.
And you were saying that some of this could be hands-on, some of it could be through isometrics. Is Bryson at the level where you need to be with him there, or can he identify, wait a second, Greg's taught me this, let me go ahead and do this or this to turn this on and activate? Because most recently I found some activations for the inguinal ligament. Or that whole, because I was having some problems with that, and I found a couple things that I can cue up real quick with an isometric hold, squeeze the core, the 90-90, and just wake them up, and then boom, right when I go to my squat, I feel better. So it's like, does he have some things that he can do like that before he jumps out on tour?
Yeah, because we have 3 years of experience of working together. He knows every one of these movements, and so like I said, there's 21 main movements in the body that make up the big muscles of the hips, the legs, the shoulders, the core, and so he knows all of them. And awesome. So when he's traveling, if he feels, oh man, I don't feel like I can rotate to the right, he knows exactly what he needs to accomplish. Is you need to perform isometric contractions like in the extreme ranges of motion and reteach those muscles how to shorten, like to fully contract into their end ranges. And so whenever he feels like, ooh, I'm not moving that way, he literally starts creating isometric contraction or performing isometric contractions to reactivate and re-stimulate those muscles. So he'll call me up and say, hey, when I do this, I feel this, and we'll work through and talk through, like, hey, try this movement. Well, I don't really feel like that's activating it, and then we'll try something else. And now he's to the point where he's doing a lot of it on his own as a Band-Aid until he gets back out here. Then we can actually go after and find out, okay, where are these weak links? But he's been very good about being able to do it on his own.
That's amazing. Talk to me about, so he's obviously put on this type of size and muscle, and because it's not traditional, like the worlds we come from, like a guy's squat went up 100 pounds, and he went up 30, like, are you pushing the muscle? You say you're challenging his tolerance. Are you pushing the muscle to a failure, like an old Mike Mentzer hit type of method to get that type of contraction so the muscle can grow, to tear it down proper? Like, what's your kind of setup like that?
So the idea is in a controlled environment, let's just take that Mike Mentzer philosophy. If you overload it, you're creating tissue damage, which is going to create an inflammatory response. And when you have inflammation, you have muscle soreness, and you're going to be weaker. And then the end result of an inflammatory response under ideal situations is growth and repair of tissue. But as we get older and more dysfunctional, a lot of times we don't get out of that inflammatory state. And that's why many people are stuck in this chronic inflammation state in their bodies, but they're basically in more of a catabolic state rather than an anabolic state. Mm-hmm. So that's why as we get older, we typically aren't able to increase our strength levels because we don't recover the way we did when we were younger. So with this process, when I'm telling you I'm 57 and doing the same thing Bryson's doing, and I have clients that are pushing 60, that we're actually seeing the same type of strength gains on a 60-year-old that we're seeing with Bryson. Awesome. And the reason is because we're overloading the muscle that would create this low-grade inflammatory response. But in the process, inflammation is what causes inhibition. So when I talked about altered communication pathways and muscle weakness under the MAT, the muscle activation technique philosophy, it's inflammation that causes this inhibition. And many times people come in with unresolved inflammation. They're chronically shut down. They're chronically weak because these communication pathways have been altered. If the body went through its normal healing and repair cycle, then the muscles, you wouldn't see this chronic inflammation. You wouldn't see the muscle inhibition and these altered communication pathway. So within the Bryson situation, what we're doing is in a controlled environment, I'm overloading him movement by movement. And I'll give you a perfect example. The first day we worked on it, we went through trunk rotation on a spinal rotation machine, and he's going through and he's maximizing his force to a weight that he could only do 5 repetitions. Okay. And after he did 5 repetitions in spinal rotation, this is a movement he's never done before because he's trained his core and neutral up to that point. We check his neuromuscular integrity, and those muscles were shut down. Those muscles, the obliques, the transverse abdominis, all the muscles I talked, they were all shut down. It's almost like an all or nothing process.
They're trying to protect.
They got overloaded.
Oh, overloaded.
And so other muscles tighten up to protect. Yeah. But because I specifically challenged the muscles that rotate the spine and overloaded them, he went into an overload. It would have been an inflammatory state. So other muscles tighten up as a protective mechanism. And so the interesting part is then on the spot, we got those muscles reactivated. And we did this with 90 pounds. We started out with 90 pounds, and that's all he could do for 5 reps. After we did the 90 pounds, after we got the muscles reactivated, we went back out. We put him on 90 pounds for 5 repetitions. He could do it, and it was much easier. So then we went up to 110 pounds. Then 110 pounds shut him down. And then we treated the muscles, got him activated. Then we went back, and now he could do 110 pounds without it shutting him down for 5 repetitions. By the time we were done, that in an hour session, just focusing on trunk rotation or spinal rotation, by the time we were done, he was doing 165 pounds for 5 repetitions without it shutting him down on the spot. And that was the day we knew we were on to something. It's like we're retraining the neuromuscular system. And what I realized is we're getting the muscles what would normally take days of inflammation to get to the repair phase of that acute inflammation leading to the growth and repair phase of inflammation. We're doing that all in a moment's time. Like we're by reactivating the muscles, we get you right into that growth and repair state, into the anabolic state, and out of the catabolic state. So really, as we go through all these exercises and overload his system, he never gets sore because we fix what we break. And so soreness is a sign of inflammation. Yeah. So if you have soreness the day after you work out, you do heavy squats and you can't sit on the toilet, it's because you overloaded the muscles. And in reality, for that moment in time, those muscles are actually weaker. The neurological input has been diminished. And so you have the loose battery cable. We fix what we break on the spot so that he can go and perform at a higher level, like immediately. And so then we do that. We've done that movement by movement, muscle by muscle. And in every movement that we've gone through, if I take those 21 main movements, I've laid it out. He's pretty much, since we started this program a year and a half ago, he's doubled his force output. Like if he was doing 90 pounds, he's doing 180. If he was doing, say, 20 pounds in shoulder rotation, he's doing 40. Every movement that he's gone through, we've doubled in force output.
And now it makes sense when you say I'm pushing the tolerance of how heavy we can go with being efficient on the movement without being shut down. That allows it all makes sense. But Greg, it's so meticulous. I got to tell you, it's
very specific. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. This is, I mean, I've worked with, I learned powerlifting at Westside, and I learned bodybuilding from Arnold personally.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I'd never heard some shit like this before. I'm gonna be honest, like this is staggering, and I'm gonna be all over your website whenever we're done with this. Yeah, it's really. Let me ask you a couple things about the nutrition. I know you don't do his nutrition, but you're around for all this stuff. There's a lot of people that are just saying, "Oh, his calorie intake, oh, his protein intake." And look, we come from, the old EAS days, 6 meals a day, phosphagen, all this stuff. But it's like, that's really at elite level, all this training, all the travel, all the range. Like, people don't realize how much time these guys put in at the range. Like the caloric intake it takes to keep 240 pounds while you're walking 18
holes.
People miss that part. So is it really that crazy if you think about it, for the amount of load or volume this guy actually does on a weekly basis?
Yeah. No, I think back when I was a strength and conditioning coach at Fresno State, and we did a nutritional analysis in my master's nutrition class, and I had access to training table, morning, noon, and night. And when we did our dietary intake, I was eating over 6,000 calories a day. But I was burning it. I'm out there working with the athletes, doing a lot of the workouts with them and the running and conditioning with them, and you burn it off. And exactly what you said, the fact, he's working out. He's out there on that driving range for hours at a time. And he obviously the caloric input, he's increased his weight. So the caloric intake, is exceeded what his caloric burn off is, because that's what he wanted to do. And he wanted to gain weight. He wants the mass, the force equals mass times acceleration. He wanted the mass time component of this because he wanted that to transfer over into his force output. And so, is it a lot for a normal person? Yes. But for the stresses he's placing his body under, he's burning it. He's burning it off.
And I think that's what people think versus a normal person that's more sedentary, plays a couple rounds at their country club on the weekend. This is a whole different, and what he's really showcased is, hey, I'm a different level athlete. This is a whole nother game that I'm going into, and I'm taking a different approach. And I think that's why you got to be one of the most sought after interviews out there right now, because people are like, what the hell is this guy doing? And, myself, like when I was doing research on you last night, I was like, this is going to be interesting because this approach is wildly different. And as you've been laying it out, it's even more so. And I just don't think people have been this meticulous, especially in this sport. And I wonder if we backtrack, when you finally understood this process, no matter what sport you were applying it to, was that, how many years ago was it? And when did it click like, ooh, this is a game changer?
Yeah, literally. I told you, by the time I was 25 years old with my own fractured vertebrae, I'm literally with patellofemoral syndrome, plantar fasciitis, SI joint dysfunction, one injury after another. I was literally 25 years old saying, if I'm this bad at 25, what am I going to be like when I'm 50? And so I sought out specialists from all fields, from strength and conditioning to physical therapy. I had the opportunity to work with some great physical therapists early on in my career that understood the biomechanics of movements and the interrelationships of joints. And the interesting factor, from every specialist that I sought out across the country, the common denominator was, you're so tight. It's the tightness that is causing all your pain. And so the modalities that were related to that tightness were, loosen up, deep tissue massage, chiropractic adjustments, foam rolling, stretching. I learned every mobilization of joints. I learned every technique there was out there. And I became the functional movement range of motion guy. And I got hired by the Utah Jazz and the Denver Broncos with that mentality. Yeah. And so there was validity behind it, but I was still dysfunctional.
But it never fixed you, did it?
It never fixed me. So for selfish reasons, I was like, there's something missing. And with the best people out there, I'm hired in pro sports, and it's like, there's still something missing. And that's when I came up with this analogy. I got exposed to muscle testing by Craig Bueller, the chiropractor at the Utah Jazz. And literally one day I stretched John Stockton, and prior to me stretching him, he had done muscle testing on him and it tested muscles in his hip, and he was strong. After I got done doing my range of motion work, and he increased 20 degrees of hip internal rotation, he was weak. And Craig Bueller looked at me and he said, what did you do? And it's like, that can't be a good thing, that I just made him weaker. And that's when I started correlating that, wow, I've been a range of motion focused guy my whole life. I just increased his range of motion. Now he has weakness. With the association with Craig Bueller, I got exposed to muscle testing. And I started realizing that as I looked at things, I realized that any place I saw a limitation in range of motion, there was correlating muscle weaknesses. And so then I would get the muscles activated and the range of motion would increase.
Yep.
So I realized I was melting the ice. By providing a sense of stability, I was melting the ice and giving the body a sense of stability so it didn't have to tighten up and protect. I came back, I was doing some work, and this goes back to my EAS days where I was working with the Broncos and I was doing some consulting with the EAS. And so they basically, I had a guy that I was working with, they let Bill Phillips, allowed me to use his mark. And I mean, great opportunity that I had back there. That's Derek West came in the picture and working with him. And I had one guy, like, I could barely bend to touch my knees for the last 10 years. And I had one guy that I was having working directly with me. I had him test and activate my abdominal muscles, which are responsible for flexing the trunk. We activated my abdominal muscles and hip flexors, and I bent down and touched my toes for the first time in 10 years. The tightness, the hamstring and erector spinae muscles that I've been focused on stretching forever weren't ever going to relax until I fixed the instability issue because the muscles couldn't contract on the front side. And literally, when muscles can't contract efficiently, they can't shorten effectively. So when they can't shorten effectively, the opposite muscles tighten up as a protective mechanism. So I realized the hamstring tightness and the low back tightness was a result of a weakness on the anterior side that those muscles couldn't fully contract. We got those muscles activated. I haven't stretched and I can still touch my toes. And that's 30 years later or 20 years later.
And so that's the thing, Greg, is people believe that they're going to stretch out of that. But the reality is you can't, it's like trying to outtrain a bad diet. It's like basically virtually impossible. And what I think is interesting is as you at that high a level practitioner, being hired by multiple pro teams, you knew as a practitioner, you're like, I'm still missing it. And
something's wrong.
Respect to that, because when you uncovered that, that's when the next level of the career and understanding came. And dude, that's how, as a practitioner, that is everything. And I've found things like this in my career, and I need to add some of the things I'm hearing you talk about, which I think will even elongate it more. And do that right. And then when you find it, it's like, ding, 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 ding.
Changed everything that I got hired in pro sports by two professional organizations for being a specialist of understanding human body function, I guess you'd say, or muscle function through a functional movement standpoint. And I realized that, I mean, I didn't have a clue. And so there was so I literally, as a range of motion focused guy, functional movement type guy, functional movement is about training the integrated system. I was a range of motion functional movement guy. Now I'm an isolated movement muscle activation guy. So both components are the paradigm shift to the opposite end of the spectrum. And I started having results that I had never seen. And all the frustrating clients like me that weren't getting better started getting better. And so it worked for a certain level of people, but I started focusing on the people like myself that weren't getting better from the conventional methods.
Wow. It's staggering. All right. A couple more questions and we'll get you out of there. How did it feel when you saw Bryson win the US Open and really go to prove at the highest level, championship level, that all of this makes sense? Because coming from your original world, this is completely abstract. Going bulk phase, completely abstract to golf. Like the way he cuts his clubs, everything about this dude, which I love. I love the disruption. But when you saw him be able to do that, what did it feel like as one of the family / team members on, Team DeChambeau?
Well, I mean, obviously, we have a lot of conversations, and there was, movement going into that tournament. I mean, it was big, and he really felt like he could tear up that course. With the idea that I don't care, I'm going to be offline anyway. If I'm hitting the ball, most guys weren't hitting fairways anyway. And I think he won the US Open with the least amount of fairways in regulation, hitting the least amount of fairways in regulation. But he knew that if he had a 90-yard wedge shot in, he had much better chance than a 140-yard wedge shot in from the rough.
Yeah.
And so like that was the time, like he'd been calling me up and saying, I hit 205 ball speed, or my club head speed's over 130. And that's the question. Well, what about accuracy? And I mean, how's that going to change the game? And how's your short game? I think he was in the top 5 in greens and regulation, or strokes gained, and putting, and strokes gained off the tee. I mean, and stroke gained, I think, in the fairways also. He was in the top 5 in all 3 categories. And it's like, you know what? Yeah, he's got the strength and power, and that's what we've worked on. And he's doing things that nobody's ever done in golf. And that's it was so amazing to see the literally this process and the concept that we talked about 3 years ago, and really focused in on a year and a half ago about now let's take it another level and strength. That's where I can say the proof is in the pudding. I mean, he's actually validated all the work that we've done. But then again, he was already good at golf. So he's already had the short game. He already has worked on his putting. He didn't lose any of that, but he gained one big key, and that was his, force output. And and that showed up in his distance. And you can't go wrong with increased distance if you have a short game. You can never go wrong with that.
And like you said, if you're off track, but you're still 400, what's it matter?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And the strength out of the rough. That's what I noticed is like, and that's what Tiger was always well known for, that he could get stuff out of the rough and still get it on. It's like a guy that's strong, he can swing with that amount of force, and it's in the rough still, but it's a different level for him.
Yeah, watching him hit the ball out of the rough, I think, is what amazed most people. Is like it was effortless. I mean, it looked like he was hitting off the fairway. Where that, especially at the pro level, when those tournaments, that's so deep. But 240 pounds with that type of mass and that type of club head speed, that's why he could do what he did by being off the fairway so much. And so, he knew it going in, and he knew it was worth the sacrifice.
That's so cool. Tell me one thing from working with Bryson that people don't know about him. Is there something that you can, is it work ethic? Is it perfection? Like what is something that people don't know about this guy?
Yeah, I think the biggest key is the work ethic is number one, because many people have said, well, let's get like you hear it on the media, is this is going to change golf, and many people are going to start trying to get the distance that Bryson has. One, it's an in-depth process, that it's not just about working out, because working out at the level that he's working out would typically start tearing down people's bodies and have the negative effects rather than the positive effects. But the other is the work ethic that, he works on his body 7 days a week. What he's transferred into his golf game, he's transferred into the same mentality and how he works out and trains. And I have many golfers that have come to me since this has all happened, and they're like, I don't want to work that hard. It's like, I'd love to see those results, but I'm not going to work that hard. So it's definitely the commitment and the work ethic that he has is pretty unique. I've worked with some high level athletes over the years, and those high level athletes, I can say that's the one common denominator from the Peyton Mannings, the John Elways, the John Stocktons, the Karl Malones, the guys that were the best at what they do. They were so committed and so focused, and they led by example. And I think if Bryson was playing a team sport, they'd be looking at him the same way that those athletes were looked at. Like, I want to do what he's doing, right? Because he's the example of hard work and how it all pays off.
I love it. Well, Greg, where can they find more information on your techniques, and where can they find you on social media?
So if you go to muscleactivation.com, it has all the information about our techniques, about the education program. We do train trainers and therapists in the technique. It's up and coming. Literally, we now have degreed programs through this Broadview University out of Minnesota. We now have degreed programs in different levels of MAT that can now people can access student loans and financial aid, or be eligible for student loans and financial aid. And literally, I feel like we're where chiropractic was maybe 50 years ago. Like, I call MAT muscle chiropractic.
Yeah.
And I mean, literally muscles move bones and muscles hold bones in proper alignment. So it's a muscle system which is going to be able to move the bones the way they're designed to move. And that's what we do with muscle activation technique. So you can find out all the information on MAT through our website, through social media channels. I'm not the best at that, but now we have a whole marketing group through the schools at Broadview University, and a lot of YouTube videos out there explaining MAT. And but now we're more presence on Instagram and Facebook and all the social media platforms. So it's out there, and I can tell you one thing, for not just because of what Bryson's done, but for the 30 years of work that's been behind this. It's a powerful tool, not only for the people as clients that can benefit from it, but the people that are looking for new careers and want to be able to, be involved in the strength and conditioning side of it from a different mentality, from a different focus. I think this creates career opportunities that we haven't had before.
Well, for lack of a better metaphor, it's like adding clubs to the bag if you're a trainer. I mean, if you have this access and you already have all these other certs and all this stuff going on, to add that to it, it's
more tools in the toolbox.
Yeah.
It separates people in the industry, because trainers and strength coaches refer to our MAT practitioners.
Yeah.
And it's not competition, it's an adjunct. It helps you. And then the next thing we know is those same trainers and strength coaches come through our program because they say, I want to have those tools, so I don't have to send my clients away to somebody else. And since if we're in the strength and conditioning world, we're muscle specialists. This is the epitome program for people that want to specialize in neuromuscular function.
It's amazing. Well, thanks for sharing the time today on the Golf and Fitness Show. I was mind blown, excited about this interview. I'll definitely be in touch, and go and check out Greg's stuff. Like, share, subscribe, tell all your friends. For the Golf and Fitness Show, I'm Cory Gregory. That's Greg Roskopf.
Roskopf, yeah.
Roskopf. Sorry, Greg. Appreciate you guys, and we are out. Later.
All right.